Welcome to Cool Tunes for a Hot Planet, the podcast where music inspires action for social and climate justice.
Hi, and welcome to Cool Tunes for a Hot Planet. This is episode 36, season 2, and I'm your host, Warren Senders. Before we get started, please take a moment to like and subscribe so we can keep bringing you inspiring music and activism all year round. These Global Notes episodes sometimes do a deep dive into a particular subject or theme, but often we profile people who are doing valuable and important work using music to change the ways that we think and feel about the crises convulsing our world. It's been one of my great joys to introduce you to some of the innovative musical heroes in climate activism, people who found new approaches to communicating climate change's facts and impacts. Today we'll meet two skilled and passionate composers, Kris Davis and Sumi Tonooka. Both women have made artistic homes in the jazz tradition, and both often venture into other realms and genres with great assurance. Although they've never met each other, their recent works are beautifully complementary, and this episode will feature them side by side. Any of us working in climate activism know those overwhelming feelings of loss and foreboding which come along with the simple act of paying attention to the news. There's a particular emotional quality sometimes called climate grief, or as I once heard someone call it, pre-traumatic stress disorder. Composer and pianist Kris Davis encountered a new term, Solastalgia, coined by philosopher Glenn Albrecht. It means the homesickness you have when you are still at home and your environment is changing in distressing ways. That word became the centerpiece of a new suite of compositions for piano and string quartet, the Solastalgia Suite, which was released earlier this year on Pyroclastic Records, Davis's own record label. I had a long conversation with her about the piece and the complex emotional layers of its sonic space, which features a virtuoso performance from Poland's Lutoslawski Quartet. Tell me about the word solastalgia.
It's a new word that a philosopher from Australia coined. His name was Glenn Albrecht. And it's basically a word to describe your feeling of loss for your home while you're still living in it. So that applies to a lot of different things, but in this case, it's mostly talking about climate change. And, I've certainly experienced that living in Calgary, and I go home now and, there's forest fires and you can't go outside, in the summer, and the sky is yellow and the air is toxic. So, that was sort of on my mind when I was thinking about titling the suite. Then found this Solastalgia, which sounded like it would be a nice title also for a suite. It was commissioned by the Jazz to Pad Festival in Wrocław, Poland. So I started working on the music, and I heard this interview with some scientists from Florida who were talking about the coral reefs down there and how they were trying to protect the coral reefs. And basically that summer, I think it was 2023, the water is just getting so hot that there was nothing they can do, and realized that the coral was bleaching and that we probably lose it, in the next 10 years. And it was interesting to hear them just talk about, their emotional relationship with that. And, they're worried about the biodiversity being lost, and just the effect that this is going to have on our planet. So I was sort of thinking about, this idea of losing your home, your livelihood, the things that are, connected to your environment.
Have you done other pieces that were in response to particular social or environmental issues?
I teach at Berkeley for the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice. And so we've done a lot of work, social justice work, and gender and race within jazz. The last album I put out is with my trio with Jonathan Blake and Robert Hurst. It's called Run the Gauntlet, and it's dedicated to 6 women pianists that were really important to me. I was just thinking about wanting to point to those women that came before me who inspired me, and say thank you and recognize them. So that album is dedicated to them. And yeah, I think these things come from, being exposed to certain information, but more importantly for me is the emotional connection to the topic. Even though I'm involved in activism, I'm not necessarily a person who will, go out and shout from the rooftops. I sort of do it more in a subtle way, through my teaching and through the music that I write and play. So each piece has a different kind of form that I'm experimenting with, and I'm always trying to create a variety for both the listener but also the players, that there's different kinds of challenges for them.
What about pressure and yield?
There's no piano in this particular movement, and the string quartet interrupts each other. There's this feeling of like sudden, seismic eruptures, and then silence, and it sort of slowly dissipates through the piece. even though this is like about a topic, that there is a lot of activism around, in a way, to me, this album is more about the idea of grief and loss and processing those kinds of difficult emotions. I'd say built into it, there's the sort of 5 or 7 stages of grief. That's part of the research of like those emotions. What do those kinds of feelings of acceptance like bubble up into, or anger? How does that affect? And that's sort of weaved into the whole piece. Not in an overt way, but it's more subtle.
You mentioned earlier that you had some other stories about developing and building and perhaps rehearsing different parts of the Solastalgia Suite. Tell me a few stories about what that was like.
So rehearsing with like a quartet that speaks only Polish, and you're sitting there like, I hope they're saying something that's going to improve the music. I don't know. I don't know what's happening right now. Or they're not like, smashing me. And then the other part was it was sort of the difference in kind of the classical approach versus like the jazz or improviser's approach. Maybe there's a thing about classical music that's about execution, and less about kind of creating something. You don't have to create anything. You have to execute it, in a way. And so it's more of like a composer's brain. Mm-hmm. When you're improvising, where you have to make ideas on the spot and be able to build on them. And that was something that was just very culturally different. So sometimes when they were left to totally improvise, they didn't know what to do, so they'd start, quoting like a Mozart concerto or something, and I was like, no, that's not the language. And so I would try to give them, little prompts and things to like bring out more of the language of the piece versus referencing, something that was unrelated.
You start the entire suite with a track called Interlude.
It's like an invitation to suddenly we're in the middle of something, right when we enter, and there's something provocative about that.
Each of us has a particular moment when we become aware of the reality of the climate emergency. We entered the theater and it's been going on for a long time.
Yeah, I love that metaphor analogy. That's so great. And that's always the hope when people listen to your music, that they find, their own conclusions or ways of understanding. So thank you for saying that.
When I was listening, I felt one emotion or one emotional layer that was moving at a slow speed and others that were moving at faster speeds. And it really, I think, reinforced the experience of the Solastalgia Suite as a very human piece of music.
I think that is like part of the way I think about music in general, both as a composer and improviser. There's a kind of these shorter, like you're saying, these shorter emotions, these quick reactions, and then there's this sort of longer arc that's sort of bubbling up underneath. And there's always a juxtaposition of, both sides that's, usually you can find it in a lot of my music. I started out as a classical pianist, I guess, and then got into jazz when I was about 13. And I sort of did both for a couple of years. In Canada, they have something called the Royal Conservatory, and you go and do like piano exams and scales and sight reading, all that stuff. So that's kind of what I came up through, which gave me a great foundation. But ultimately, I think that wasn't the right style of music, or I don't know if it's style, but it's just the experience of, well, I guess through jazz it was more community based, and that really spoke to me. And then the idea of improvisation and being free to play a wrong note and play it over and over again, and that was cool. was very freeing, So I sort of gravitated more towards jazz in high school, and decided to pursue that as a career.
Your second movement is called An Invitation to Disappear. Talk a little bit about that title.
That title actually comes from a visual artist that I've worked with for many years, Julian Charriere. He does a lot of work on climate change and the impacts of climate change. And this particular title is from a video that he did of a palm oil plantation, where they tore down the whole forest and then built this sort of monoculture of palm trees. I guess it's maybe like an hour long, and it's just this like kind of drone flying through these palm trees through day and night, and then at the end it ends in a rave at the end. But he does a lot of work that's inspired me to kind of look at some climate change issues in the music. And on that piece I have like one melody that starts, it's about 8 bars long, and it's stated at the beginning by the violin, and then it sort of keeps cycling the 8 bars and moves into a different key at one point. But the idea was that each time it cycled through, I was going to start adding more chromaticism around the melody, almost like a bebop line, weaved in between this kind of modal melody.
Now, are you creating an explicit structural reference between, like, temperature increases and the amount of chromaticism? Is there some degree of data sonification?
No, I'm not. I didn't really think of it that way. It was more just, form is really interesting to me. I write a lot of experiment with different kinds of form. But actually, I've never used data sonification, which is funny you mentioned that, because I teach at Berkeley, and we have a guest that's there now, Laura Pellegrinelli, and she was encouraging our students to use data sonification, and so something I might try in the future, but I didn't use that on this. Well, I have never written for strings before, so I had to do some research. Just listening to some of my favorite composers. Also checking out some of the other jazz musicians that have written for the Lutoslawski Quartet. They always commission a jazz artist every year. It was a steep learning curve for me in terms of like finding the right way to communicate. But they're also experienced with working with jazz artists and who might not, have that lexicon in their practice. So they were very kind and we figured it out. And in general, I feel like classical artists and jazz artists are really, they've always been crossing over, but even more now. There's just like such an interest on both sides, and there's a lot of like conceptual approaches to both improvised music and classical music. Some of the pieces in the suite are meant to be more an experience of an environment. So like Towards No Earthly Pole has this very it's not really a story, it's just a sort of a feeling, a space that you enter into.
Are you going to be able to perform Solastalgia Suite again?
I hope so. I was just talking to one of the string players yesterday, and they want me to come to Poland and play. So hopefully it will keep going,
Kris Davis, thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I really enjoyed listening to Solastalgia Suite. I look forward to sharing it with our listeners.
Thanks, Warren. Thanks for having me. It was fun to chat.
Sumi Tonooka grew up in Philadelphia and came up in the city's intensely creative jazz community, playing and studying with legendary musicians like drummer Philly Joe Jones, pianist Mary Lou Williams, and pianist Stanley Cowell. Over the past 4 decades, she's made a name as one of the most innovative and expressive musicians on the scene, often branching out wherever her restless creativity takes her. Her recent recording is also a suite, titled Under the Surface, and it's built around the idea that trees and arboreal ecosystems communicate with one another, sharing nourishment, support, and protection in ways that forest scientists are only just beginning to understand. At a time when many of our human support networks are endangered by creeping fascism, shortened attention spans, and commercialized AI slop, she sees the communities of trees as an example for all of us how we can live better, kinder, and calmer lives. With her group, Alchemy Sound Project, she created a set of pieces which express this deep underground communality, using the vocabulary and forms of the jazz idiom she's spent her life exploring. Back in the 1960s, Ornette Coleman said he thought jazz needed to explore new kinds of emotions, and Sumi Tonooka's Under the Surface is an important and beautiful example of how to do this. Tell me a little bit about how Under the Surface came to be. I gather you were at least partially inspired by Richard Powers' book, The Overstory.
That kind of happened as I was writing the piece. Someone gave me that book, so I was reading it as I was writing the music. So it wasn't the exact seed, but that's what happens a lot of time when you have an idea for something, and then a lot of sources of inspiration appear. And I was drawn to that book because of the form of the book, especially the way that the book used the element of trees as this connecting source between all the varying stories.
It seems like you were really inspired by this whole idea of interconnectivity and root networks, the things that are happening outside of our perception.
Well, I took it as a metaphor that the roots of trees, they have the network, where the cells go out and find weak areas and send nutrients to those places that even outside of their own root system or outside of their own genus. When I started to get into the idea of that, of course, the metaphor itself, I started to apply it to my own life. I was thinking about ways in which I've been nourished by my own community, just the whole network of support that I've received up into, throughout life.
I'm very moved by the idea that human beings can offer support and nourishment for one another.
I think that's a really important statement, Warren, because that right now, that is what's so crucial. That very thing is what's so crucial. I just saw this beautiful interview of an 80-year-old couple that they said they weren't comfortable like being out on the streets and in protests and whatnot because they felt way too vulnerable at their age. But they were saying one thing they can do is drive this young lady home back and forth to school whose mother had just been taken from their family.
Right.
And so, they say, we can do this, and you think about all those little actions and it really comes down to that. I mean, it comes down to community. I mean, I think of Alchemy Sound Project, this group that I have. We are a composers collective. It's a small microcosm of the community. What's so beautiful is that we kind of look like the world. I mean, we do. We're multi-generational, just about everything you can think of. We've been together for 10 years, and it's not like...
That's long in jazz terms.
It is, and the reason why that works that way is because we're all friends. Because what our mission is as a band is basically to learn, record, and try to perform each other's music over a period of time, like committing to it, even through our lifetimes, if we can do that. I mean, so far we've made it to 10 years, so that's a microcosm of an example of community. And even I would say to young people in the music business right now, that is an essential aspect of what it is to make this music and to survive on this music, is to form community and to have microcosms of support, that you can create. And that's what we have to do now, especially now.
Many of the different musical traditions that we have are kind of dialogues between the present and then all the way back into humanity's remote past. They're all in dialogue together.
I'm aware of that. I'm becoming actually more aware of the responsibility that also comes with that, that you want to protect that you want to endorse that you want to articulate that, and I was thinking very much of my mentors. I studied with Mary Lou Williams. She was one of my teachers, like 19 years old. I didn't have a lot of lessons, but I had enough to be in her presence. She was authentically the history of the music. And so to be with someone like that, I mean, we all have our mentors. I also, aside from Mary Lou, I had studied with Dennis Andoli, I studied with Stanley Cowell.
Right.
And he died during COVID, and I definitely wanted to show some of my feeling about his influence on me in the song that I wrote about him.
You had composed an orchestral work that was around Harriet Tubman. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, so I won this thing called the Emerging Black Composers Project. In my research, I came upon a poem by Sonia Sanchez. It was called Haiku for Harriet Tubman. And once I read that poem, it kind of clenched it for me. So there's 3 movements. First movement is called Running, and then the second movement is called Picture Her. And then the last one is called Turning South. And each of those movements was inspired by a stanza in Sonia's poem. I'm just so amazed at the fact that she did what she did, and as often as she did, and how many people she was actually able to successfully free. And her own life is very remarkable. And in fact, the title of the work is based off a letter from Frederick Douglass to Harriet Tubman, because she wanted him to write a foreword to a book that was being written about her life, of autobiographies. And he wrote her back to say, "What, are you kidding? You want me to write a foreword for your book? Only the midnight sky and silent stars. They were the only witnesses to you in your nighttime journeys, freeing these people." I'm going to share a clip with you of a piece from the suite called Interval Haiku. The feeling that I want to create is like of this sort of life force, like, because it's these cells, it's like we have it in our own body too, you know, we have our immune system. So in Interval Haiku, I was getting more into the mystical or the shadowed and mysterious elements of that. I have another one called Mother Tongue. I think that one is more about like influences. I guess mother tongue in the sense of like these traditions that we share, musical traditions that we share. music and in a lot of the compositions themselves, I wanted the drums to kind of go through the music and sort of visit each player, and that each player would have a chance to shine, as if they were each like a tree unto themselves.
Is there anything in the world that you really want people to know?
Well, when I was looking at that question, the thing I was thinking about were just within my own community, like within Alchemy Sound Project. Every single one of the musicians is so unique, and it would be so wonderful if people were to explore who they are, because they're also holding an incredible history. If you look to anybody's history that you're interested in and you want to know about them, it's worth exploring the people, who they come from, like who they actually are. Sometimes I feel like, especially young people, aren't curious enough, or just don't think it's that important, but it is so important to really go deep. For anyone listening to this piece of music, the work itself, that people understand that it's really the small things and the small connections, and building on those, to get to know your neighbors, to reach out. The power is in the people. That's kind of the underground message. Thank you so much, Warren, and also congratulations on your podcast, and it's really important to do that. Thank you for inviting me. I was very happy to do the interview.
And that's it for today's episode. You can find out more about our featured artists at sumitonooka.com and krisdavis.net. I'd like to thank both artists for taking the time to speak with me and sharing their insights. I'd also like to thank Anne Braithwaite for helping us set up both interviews. If you're looking for opportunities for meaningful action, you can use this QR code to find events and organizations working on behalf of the environment or our democracy. For the credits, we'll hear Kris Davis and her trio playing her own composition, Heavy Footed. Please remember to like and subscribe so we can keep bringing you inspiring music and activism all year round. I'm Warren Senders, and this has been Cool Tunes for a Hot Planet, Episode 36, Season 2. Thank you for listening.